Welcome to the Breakup Theory, a podcast about ending things and collective liberation. On today's show, I talk with my dear friend Girl Cock about the breaking up of Femboys Against Fascism. We had previously spoken about the group on an episode of The Final Straw Radio in May of 2023, which I'll link in the show notes. The group was formed to counter anti-migrant rallies taking place in Liverpool. However, the members decided that it was better to end the group than to continue just for the sake of it, allowing them to pursue new actions and different ideas. We use this breakup to get into deeper conversations. So, content warning, we talk about sexual assault and rape, though not in detail. We discuss the continuity of fascism into transphobia and assault and groups protecting themselves over listening to victims or holding anyone accountable. We talk about failures of the left, separatism and self-defense, the use of violence, and the respectability politics marginalized or oppressed people are asked to do. At the end, we discuss adult supremacy as well. I think this conversation is provocative and generative. Girl Cock is eloquent and speaks of her own experiences organizing, and she has a keen sense of autonomy and contributes a great deal to our understanding of breaking up. I hope you like it. At the end of the episode, as a special treat, I've included the Femboys Against Fascism song, so stay tuned for that. Remember, we set up an online submission form at forum.jotform.com/thebreakuptheory/stories, as well as a phone line at 917-426-6548 for you to share your breakups. We'll record regular episodes discussing your situation and sharing our political and personal perspectives. Our first episode got a lot of great feedback, so I'm excited to keep growing this project. So please submit if you want to hear us talk about your stuff. Yeah, I'm here with my friend and comrade Girl Cock, and we are kind of returning to a conversation we've had before privately, but also on The Final Straw, and want to start our conversation with a recent event, the splitting of the group in Liverpool, Femboys Against Fascism. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision and what led up to it?
Yeah, so, we never really planned on being a group that existed to last. We've got a lot of criticisms, and this is something that's broadly shared by a lot of us in our crew, of the organising spaces on the left, the anti-fascist groups that already exist, and they have an obsession with reproductive futurism. I think they want to constantly protect their own existence and the furtherance of the group and the little hierarchies that develop within the group, rather than really just destroying it and moving on to different affinities. I feel like these sort of long-lasting groups lead to abuse and quite easily create little hierarchies. Also, we're honestly part of it a bit scared of getting prescribed. It's good to disband and do other stuff just to avoid repression, because too many activists on the left have a good idea of different individuals involved in our stuff. And we want to be a bit more anonymous.
You were worried that people on the left would snitch on you. So prescribe meaning that your group would get listed as a group for the police to target.
I mean, apparently we were on the gang database around the last time we spoke to you. I mean, that's just any sort of group of minorities that hang out together to the British state. But worried a bit about repression. Also worried about doxing from other leftists. We've doxed rapists and rape apologists and transphobes on the left who know some details about our lives. It's a risk we're willing to take because fuck abusers, they're fascists. Should deal with them the way we deal with fascists, and if they just keep getting away with their shit, they keep being able to harm folk, then
maybe we could go into that, because the group itself started as a response to specifically fascist organizing in Liverpool, anti-migrant organizing. So you're countering in the streets fascist groups, but you sort of, in what you've been saying, then you've kind of expanded the countering fascists to also looking at these kind of authoritarian fascist tendencies within leftist groups. Can you talk about how it kind of developed in that direction?
Yeah, so part of it was we were already dealing with issues, and we already had heard stuff around sexual harassment problems on the left when we were doing the initial countering. And by the time that we spoke last, we'd already had a split with the local scenes and sort of seen the transphobia. And I've seen I mean, I've spoke to myself personally to so many different trans folk who've been raped or abused or sexually harassed in activist spaces. It's a bigger threat to
And
the
again,
folk
you
I
can
care about
support
and
the
the folk I
project and my
love and
other
the folk
work
who
at
inspire me and make me want to get out of bed in the morning is like these predatory lefties who claim to be pro-trans and a lot of fascists. Fascists are dangerous and like they'll attack us on the streets, but like they'll attack us in our bedrooms and at bars, and it's invisibilized as fuck. They get away with it. They get away with it because all the means that victims have to like resist that they're allowed to do that doesn't make them just be seen as some hysterical individual, it are just like completely ineffective, like justice processes that try and reform abusers, that try and reform transphobes and trying to reform apologists rather than just kicking them out of our spaces.
Yeah, I think you're making an interesting distinction because like facing off with fascists in the streets is like one kind of confrontation that doesn't necessarily, I mean, unless you get maybe docs, like follow you home. But with people that you organize with, like you have a shared space that and a different kind of like vulnerability, I guess, because you're supposedly not in that moment in a conflict, but trying to work together. So,
Yeah.
do you feel like this is particularly targeted towards trans people, trans women, in particular, trans femmes in your area?
I do think so, definitely. Yeah, I can't speak as to other folks' experiences as much, but I can say as a trans individual, as a tranny, I mostly speak to other trans folk who've been sexually harassed or abused in the scene. And it's mostly like, I mean, I could say for like Liverpool, the scene's predominantly cis. It's connected with TERFs. It's connected with fucking Helen Steel. You know, there's other spaces and there's other crews that like are more queer focused, and there's still issues around trans misogyny and sort of sexual abuse being covered up.
I was just wondering if those queer groups were like, yeah, were they more cis dominated queer groups like gay, lesbian groups? Or
the one I've got in mind, no, actually quite a lot of trans folk. I think there's like rape culture is so prevalent that it invades all of our space. Now trans folk much less likely to be, you know, to propagate that shit because we're so affected, we're so harmed by it. But yeah, like it's this stuff, like it slowly kills people. It drives folk away from like their networks of like trust and like who they can be around. I feel like abusers and apologists and transphobes in our spaces, in our movement, it's not my movement. they're you know, then I want to like ruin their lives. I want to like harm them so that they're away from us, so that we've got our own autonomy. Yeah.
Would you think that like some of this connects? I mean, like the UK is notorious for its TERF problem and anti-transness. I mean, in a different way than here in the States, which it tends to be led by like Christo-fascists. It doesn't come from people who claim some kind of feminist idea typically, or like any kind of liberal feminism. Do you think that is part of the reason it keeps turning up in kind of leftist spaces too?
I think so. Like, I've never been to so-called America, but I do know that like in this country, the trot groups were all very pro-Soviet Union, very like in denial of like the genocide against queers committed by like Soviet states and socialist states for a very long time until like the fall of the Berlin Wall. And still most of them are in denial about that. Then the anarchist groups, like they're affiliated with actual TERFs, like the ACG came about as like an AFED split, specifically a split over transphobia. And then there's a situation with like Anarchist Federation, who originally, you know, they were on the better side of that transphobia split with the ACG. They've got a transmisogynistic rapist as a member who they protect. So it's so common. I mean, like, you know, my experiences with like the IWA, Solidarity Federation, absolutely fucking wretched. You know, there's a bunch of like cis rape apologists in this city, and then you find out that they've got friends in other cities around the country who are doing similar apology, victims being completely ignored. I really had amazing backup from another trans multiplicity in Salford who like really backed me up and left in solidarity, and that was really best. But yeah, it's so fucking common.
Is like Salford in Liverpool, the local solidarity?
Yeah, there was basically an awful sexual harassment cover up. This was by the time of our last conversation, and then since then we found out that they had a member who's a rapist that sexually assaulted a trans individual down in Cardiff before moving here, in like a Zapatista educational that she partly organised. I'd organised with Anna, the rapist, beforehand. Yeah, it's really sickening how like these folk can just like they show up in our spaces, they show up in our scenes. No one told me what happened with Anna. It was after we beefed the scene already. It was like way after that we found out, and
Like
It's
that
because
people
these
already
things
knew that this
protect.
person had done harm?
I mean, it had already come up in Kurdistan Solidarity Network by the time we'd mentioned it, and they're a national group. When Solidarity Federation, like when we sort of made them acknowledge it, they had a meeting in the social centre, a meeting called by the rapist to basically be like, you know, these are false accusations from trans folk who we already know lie about sexual harassment.
Wow.
Yeah, like wretched, and that's pretty common. Like, I don't know many groups, even like so some of the ones that I've been more affiliated with, still have fucking problems with transphobia. I think, yeah, part of the problem is organising with cis people, doing stuff with cis people, and I'm a hypocrite there because I've done stuff with cis people. But yeah,
I want to go to that too, but I guess I was thinking, could you talk a bit, like we started our conversation talking about the kind of ending of Femboys Against Fascism as a particular project. And one of the things that you were talking about was how you were trying to like work against the way that groups and organizations want to perpetuate their own existence to the detriment of any kind of effectiveness that they might have. Do you feel like when these anarchist and leftist spaces rife with transphobia and abusive behavior, when they try to like silence you, is it under the interest of like making the group continue? Is it under the idea that we don't want to rock the boat because we have more important work to do? Like how do they present it?
they present it as, I mean, they're a step away from saying identity politics, but they do present it in like, we don't want to rock the boat, we're doing the important work, this stuff is too personal. I've had fuckers tell me, cis fucking white anti-fascists tell me that, oh, stuff with the calling out the abuse and that it's too personal, like we need to get back to the real politics. I mean, as, you know, a fellow trans feminist, you'll know that like the personal is political. This shit affects our lives very directly. I can't talk about this in some sort of like just purely theoretical way like they want us to.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole point behind the conversations that I want to have, is that like our supposed anarchism has to be something that we enact in our relationships with people, whether we're organizing or just like, you know, having friendships, romances, whatever. Like it's not something that is separate and only kind of external. And I mean, I see this too, like, you know, not even to the extremity of assault. So many organizing spaces are just like terrible to be in because people will like claim that they're right. They'll claim like your idea, if it doesn't match with what they want, is like wrong or taking the attention away. Like it's so hard in so many spaces to just like, for us to even deal with each other without fight. So like, I mean, I've experienced this recently, just like trying to organize with a group and being like, I'm splitting from this group. Not because I've been harmed, like just fuck this, you know? Yeah, it seems to be a tendency. What do you think is the difference in how it shows up in kind of like quote unquote leftist spaces versus like anarchist spaces? Do you see a difference in quality and how?
I think there's a difference in language. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think like, you know, commies, tankies, libs, they talk about it in terms of their like they have this like sort of punitive approach, and Cindy's also have this sort of like, we're not focusing on the people, we're not focusing on the majority, and by the majority they mean the sort of cis straight white guy. I think anarchist spaces tend to use language around like reforming folk who do oppressive violence and like forgive, and this like forgiveness. There's like a fucking awful pacifism culture in the British anarchist scene, and this non-violence culture where it's sort of, I mean, I think I said it to you just before the conversation, but it's like anarcho, not prisons. You know, we're going to take folk and we're going to put them in a place, you know, that they can't leave, but they wouldn't want to because it's so great anyway. We're going to have someone tell them about how they've been bad and they've done awful things, and then we're going to get folk in a room together to compromise. It's got this sort of utopianism and this, like, to me, it's very colonial and like deeply like white supremacist and cis supremacist. It's this idea like that we need to like manage the world, that we need to like manage our like other communities. Whereas I just sort of want to relate to these things autonomously and think that, well, I'm a tranny. There's not many other trannies. If folk are coming around raping the trannies, I just want to kick them out or kick their ass. I don't want to like try and like come to a position where this, oh, like they've gone through a process and they've changed and they're now a better person. It's like, no, fuck that. And it's something that was like pressured on us by so many different anarchists in the country. Absolutely second by the left. Yeah. Not saying I'm perfect myself, but yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the experience you had of like bringing up, naming these assaults, abuse, harm, and the kind of pressure that was put on you to like go through accountability process or so-called transformative justice?
Yeah. So when we initially doxed a rapist, I got phoned up by another rapist telling me that it was so awful that what I'd done, and I've basically just done the fascists' work for them, which, you know, I thought to myself, it is good that they're a little bit scared. But the response from a lot of scenes, communities, was basically like, we're not going to share it. What can we do to help except, you know, share the dog? I mean, there's a reason we shared their name. Like, they moved city to get away from the fact that they sexually assaulted trans folk. Like, we shared their name and we shared their face because, like, you know, we've tried going through these types of processes before. They don't fucking seed anything. Yeah, and these scenes will continue to, like, exist and protect their fuckers. I think we've dealt them a good blow.
I mean, you brought like this kind of accusation of fascism by the people that you're calling out, or the organization that you're asking. I guess it sounded like what you wanted to happen was first like informing people of a harmful person, like moving from town to town, which is like, that's like, to me, one of those, it's like one of the tactics we have in this world that we live in to try to keep each other safe. But when you bring that to a group and say, like, there's someone in your group that has like seriously hurt people, and you are asking them to like kick that person out, not to like try to find a way to transform them and get you to be able to share space together. Like, that's not what you wanted.
Yeah, like, it comes from a very, like, privileged position where, you know, folk want to save folk, and they usually only seem bothered in saving the folk who've done harm when that harm is oppressive violence towards others, whether it's like sexual abuse or whatever. They don't seem that interested in helping out folk when they enact violence from the position of oppression. That goes against what's supposed to happen in a lot of people's minds, you know.
Like when someone who is marginalized hurts someone else? Is that what you were saying?
Oh yeah, everyone put fucking pearl clutches. Like, I've been banned from so many different places and spaces and scenes now for, at the end of the day, like, defending myself. Like, you know, there's a few times I've struck folk first, but that's because they're like rape apologists, and it's not like I've never like tried to get folk kicked out of scenes. All the folk who've told me that they're pro-trans before, the cis folk, when they see this sort of stuff happen, they clutch their pearls and they're like, oh, we don't want you back. You know, you're just going around doing violence, and it's the invisible violence that's really killing the folk I love. It's why I fight the left just as hard as I fight the right, because, like, you know, from a perspective of like, I'm a tranny who doesn't want to get like, I just want my autonomy. I don't want doctors or police or teachers or anyone to tell me what to fucking do. I don't want leftists to abuse me. I just want to like help mother trannies with like warnings about folk. I can't fucking prevent folk from joining groups. I want to crush these groups if I can. Yeah.
I mean, do they have any examples of their processes working to stop abuse and assault?
I mean, they can probably draw up some. I mean, one of the examples is that the same rapist who rang me up to be like, oh, you shouldn't, you're doing the work of the fascists. I mean, they went through a transformative justice process and, you know, apparently came out a lot better on the other side. And I've seen transformative justice. I mean, I've just not seen transformative justice used in a way that's not to like protect folk when they rape or do harm. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I have a different experience, but it's not necessarily less pessimistic in a way. Like, I've seen accountability processes take the perspective of the person who is harmed very seriously, but usually what I've seen happen is that like the person who, you know, who was either, I don't know, it could range in whatever they did, right? Like assault or abuse or whatever, dips out of the process because there's nothing holding them there and they just go live their life somewhere else. But in the end, they basically become excluded from the scene, which seems to be like sort of what you are looking for. Like, not an attempt. When we've talked before, you've talked about it in this way that like when you bring up this, you know, in any kind of particular situation, people want to force you into a room with the person that hurt you and make you come to terms with each other. And you're asking to like have a space where this person doesn't get to run the space, basically, because when you are a victim and you speak out, you are thereby often excluded from so many places.
Yeah.
I think like the thing that you're objecting to often is like that this kind of idea of process actually is a way to force you to like, to forgive, to meet this person who isn't necessarily have any incentive to change.
And I think processes that are like already like structures and that are in like place, they protect like folks like already existing biases and inequalities. You know, like a lot of it in anarchist spaces comes down to a council of elders, a council of folk who've been there the longest, who end up making the decisions. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an aspirational quality, like where people, yeah, like we want to believe that people can fuck up and then learn and not fuck up again. Right.
But for me, that's on them, not the victim, to
Right.
like change. Yeah.
But also, like, I mean, in a good actual attempt of accountability, it's not, yeah, they shouldn't, the people doing this shouldn't make the person who's harmed do that work unless for some reason they wanted to. But like that's ridiculous. That makes no sense to me to be like, it's your job to educate.
I was just going to say, one of the things that we've really embraced is like just targeting and like harming these folk who do this shit as much as possible, the same way that we harm the fash. It's to intimidate them. It's to make other lefties see it and be like, oh, I might get beat up at the next gathering if I'm an awful apologist. You know, it's really liberating, and like it's obviously, I don't want to glorify it. As much as we can harm these folk, it feels like we're sort of sending a message, you know, just that trannies we're not going to just let folk fuck with our bodies. We're going to fucking hurt folk who fuck with us.
It is the same sort of like a kind of anti-fascist mentality of like that you don't reason with these people. You don't make, like, there's not a space for rational argument, but like confrontation is what is in order to stop assault.
Basically, yeah, like they try and use the language of like leftism and like, you know, the same sort of like say that they believe the same things, but at the end of the day, misogynists are fascists, transphobes are fascists, and if they're you know, rapists and apologists and abusers, they're all fascists, and you know, if they can't get over that shit, they should get in the ground. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, this is something I think it's like a wall that we hit like over and over again, is that like while we're supposedly struggling to like, you know, whatever, build a new world in the shell of the old or in the ashes of the old or whatever, that the power systems that we're countering also are inside of us, and a lot of people will act those things out, and then that, you know, that's also a reason why a lot of groups end, right? Like not like Femboys Against Fascism ended willingly, not because of an internal conflict, but because a kind of consensus to end it. But a lot of groups splinter and end because of this kind of harm. Because
I mean, I will also say that we had, like, by the end, we had differences. We've all gone off to do our own stuff now. It's the affinities that existed, I really think were beautiful while they lasted, and I'll always cherish them, but like they don't exist the same. I'm moving on to new affinities, and different folk are as well.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That you transform in your process, and I think that like what makes affinity group kind of organizing good is its flexibility, that it doesn't trap you into one thing, and that like you momentarily can align to do this thing and then split. No, nothing's holding you there except for like in that action that you shared.
Love keeps me so fucking close to folk. Love and like hatred of our enemies, but like I think I've really fallen in love with a lot of the folk I've done stuff with. I fell in love with the lifestyle over a year ago now. Probably never going to give it up.
What you mean by the lifestyle?
Just the sort of constantly trying to confront fash, constantly like trying to organize counter stuff, constantly trying to find fascists, more information about them, to target abusers, to find out what abusers are doing, like just to keep like the heat on these fuckers, to keep the heat on all our enemies, and like finding friends who share those passions. Like it's something I'm deeply in love with, and I really cherish those connections, and that's part of why I do this, is to build those connections, because I'm not going to find, you know, part of it's to make friends. I'm not going to make friends who share this interest in like destroying that which is destroying us if I don't go destroy shit that's destroying me. So it's, you know, like I'm glad I met you through, you know, my anarchism, and I sort of pursue that. Like it is very personal for me. I want to make friends who I trust and care about and can do shit with.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about this kind of like this draw towards a separatism that you and your people there are going towards, but also push towards in a way, like that you feel like when you said you don't want to organize with cis people anymore. Yeah, talk a little bit about what your feelings about kind of like, you know, a trans separatism.
Yeah, I feel like even cis folk so like most cis folk, I feel like just see us as objects of, you know, ridicule or like danger. Like it's in Whipping Girl in it of like the deceptive and pathetic tran archetypes. That I think that's the space we occupy for pretty much all cis folk. And cis feminists are just turfs, but they're turf like I mean like pro-trans cis feminists I think are just turfs in the way that they try and like enforce and really are very glad to accept their role as gatekeepers of womanhood. You know, when they accept me as a real woman, oh, you know, that's when I really feel like I've made it, when the cis bitches think I'm one of them. It's like, nah, I don't really accept their like gatekeeping of femininity. And I've had it from like so many cis feminists as well. And when shit gets real, when, for example, I get attacked by like an aging individual who, you know, I punch them once and they fall to the ground, it doesn't look like I'm just getting beat up there and taking it and being the like perfect victim. It looks complicated. It looks like there's systemic violence going on that doesn't necessarily equate to the like physical violence that's going on. And folk are very quick to just sort of like revert into their like dangerous tranny, like ignore all the structural oppression that's going on in the situation. All I see is a dangerous tran. Yeah, so I'm very anti-cis feminists. I'm very anti-cis people in general. I think cis folk won't ever see us as anything but objects. And I say that as an absolute hypocrite who has friends who are cis.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Some of my best friends are cis.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you feel that? Do you find this like this kind of division within trans people too? Because like I mean, yeah, I have an experience where I mostly hang out with trans and queer people, and that feels way better for me. But then when I think about like trans politics and like trans people talking about politics, I often find them lacking unless they're also anarchists, you know, because I think there's such a pull towards a kind of like liberal mindset. Like all these kinds of arguments of trying to like to kind of prove that we're deserving of this or that right. Like we keep ceding territory to the the fascist forces that want to control everyone's bodies. Yeah, I don't know. I find that a lot of trans politics kind of are lacking.
Yeah, it's really depressing. I mean, it's basically any liberation struggle throughout history. It's got like most of the fuckers who are being oppressed and in that struggle are also not the most based and awesome to hang out with and organize with. I think it's just a lot of folk are real shit. Like there's structural and there's systemic stuff, but there's also like I just don't have affinity with most individuals. I think a lot of individuals are really comfortable with oppression when it doesn't affect them. Like I've seen ableism from so many trans people. I've seen transphobia from so many disabled people.
No, that makes sense. And I want to like kind of, you know, go back on what I said, because like I do tend to have affinity with trans people. And I think that trans people do things that are like whatever anarchist or liberatory, even if they don't necessarily talk about them in that way, because like I think the possibility of trans life really relies on kind of working outside of those systems of power.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful thing about transness that I really hold very dear, and I've got a bit of affinity with every trans individual because it's like, yeah, we're destroying civilization. Civilization wants to kill us. Our very existence is rebellious and beautiful.
And I think, I mean, this was making me think also about how like what we see often like in the kind of quote unquote political realm or organizing world is like one thing, but like maybe the more important work and action is stuff that we don't see, can't see, shouldn't see, because it can't be brought into the light without either like compromising itself or calling down repression upon it. So there's like another sort of aspect of like what doesn't get named. And I feel like kind of the way that you're engaging with organizing is like talking about this, because it's the stuff that the people don't want to talk about or hear, right? I mean, we see this also with like the situation with the genocide in Gaza, right? That like people can talk a lot about how genocide is wrong, and they can talk about the suffering of the Palestinian people, but not face the attempts of Palestinians to liberate themselves through force, right? It's what you were saying before. Like they want a suffering victim, not a person who's armed and you know ready to fight for their life.
I mean, it's a really good comparison, because it's like, yeah, folk constantly moralize about Hamas, and you know, everyone who's bitching about Hamas is still like supporting, you know, the genocide on Gazans. I mean, Like, I don't like Hamas, just to clarify, I'm trans. But like, I'm not going to go out and condemn them because, like, no, it's folk fighting for their lives. And like, there's probably trans folk who've been through that fucking org. You know, I believe that we've probably been in a lot of liberation struggles and wiped out of history from it. And I have like incredible solidarity with like the trans folk in Gaza who, you know, they seem to be so ignored by like the trans community and by like the struggle for Palestinian liberation. I try and like have empathy there because it's hard to think. It's hard to think how much they're suffering and like, you know, their liberation matters too.
I think you brought up some good points because, like, you know, yeah, I don't support Hamas, but they are a force of defense for the in Gaza, right, against Israel, and that's like a fact. And I do think that we can like support Gazan self-determination, Palestinian self-determination, and without having to support like a particular group. And I think we get really stuck on this idea that like you have to endorse things. Like, I don't know, like this whole social media thing too, people being like basically having to have an opinion about everything, right? Like not every person or every group is there asking for other people to okay it, right? To acknowledge it, or whatever. Like that, and we don't have to. Yeah, we don't have to say shit about everything.
Not everyone wants to save the world. Some folk just want to save themselves and the folk they love.
I think a question saving the world is also this like big idea that doesn't really match up to like to actions in a way. I don't know. I keep getting this is where I'm trying to go in my understanding of anarchism, that it's like that we keep getting kind of trapped in these like leftist ideas and liberal ideas of how we'll go about like fixing things or building this new world that take our attention away from the like kind of anarchist ways of doing things that can't be recognized in that way. And so like this is like with groups and stuff, I think this is something that I think about a lot. Like, I don't know, the history that we receive of liberation struggles will revolve around the official groups and like the people who document themselves. But there's always something else more complicated going on the ground anywhere you're at, right? And like we like to simplify things and categorize things and classify them in a way that can't really apprehend the kind of the way that people actually function in the world. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think it also falls into like a sort of, it's a heroicism, but like some sort of historical heroicism for organizations. Like a lot of folk do this with like the Black Panthers, and like, you know, Black Panthers did a lot of good things. Also, we can't just try and like replicate that now because that wasn't a product of like the education programs and like the socialism or whatever. It was a product of like folks' material needs and like desires for like individuals' desires for liberation and the ways that they were willing to take to carry that out at the time. I feel like we can try and like glorify like things of the past and be like, oh, the Black Panthers brought about Black liberation. And I don't know much about Black liberation, but I assume it was like more than one org. It was all the folk who were fighting before and still do on the streets. Every time, you know, you punch a racist in the face, or, you know, for example, with transphobia, which I should be better talking on, you punch a transphobe in the face. That's engaging in that struggle. We don't have to be part of the fucking PSL or the SWP or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And a lot of people, I mean, if we think about the Black Panthers, like the Black anarchists, like often were people who came through the Black Panther Party and then had a critique of the authoritarian impulses, or like the, you know, the ML or MLM kind of politics that a lot of that like the kind of centralized leaders of the Black Panther Party espoused. And they would be like, well, actually there were problems with this, and they come to a different agreement. So there's like a way that we go through these experiences in groups and come up against like, here's a problem, which I think also speaks back to the ending of groups, right? Because like when a group exists just to perpetuate itself, then it can't do that kind of critique that, you know, oh, this isn't working because like someone has power, or we're using a bad politics to like think about what we want to do in the world, or we're all enacting trans misogyny because of the way that we're doing things, and we can't access that because we're so committed to this one thing that we started with.
Yeah, I just think, like we should destroy ourselves before we become the stuff we hate. I mean, I think a lot of folk who get involved into like activism and shit don't have this assumption that like our enemies also had good intentions. In a lot of cases, when they started off, like the institutions that we're fighting, a lot of them were still created with like by fascists who had good intentions for their like quote unquote people. Like, I feel like it's a problem with trying to like create these like trying to like imagine a new world for other folk, imagine a society for other folk to live in. Like I shouldn't manage other folks' lives. Not everyone wants to be vegan and do the shit I do. You know, I shouldn't hang out with folk who I beef with. Yeah, I hate the idea of like trying to council manage the world.
Now it's time for a break. Welcome back to our conversation.
No, but this is really the stuff that I like to get into, because like when I always am saying this, so it's maybe kind of annoying. I don't know if people like listen to me, but that like the thing about anarchism is that it has to allow for like everyone to have different experiences and want different things, like, which is really hard for like within the kind of revolutionary tradition, but also within any kind of state logics to imagine like a kind of infinitely differentiable multiplicity, right? Not mass, not a group of people like that can be identified with like this one need or one desire. And I think it's very hard for us to think this way often when we're trying to organize things, because we have to like imagine people falling in line on one idea. And I think this is why we get trapped in identities too often, right? Which I think is like something that you've been talking about, is how certain kind of identities can be weaponized against other kinds of identities to silence things. But I think it's like almost, I don't think many people, even anarchists, have really met the task of imagining that, and like that there could be disagreements in the desires, right? And that you could still maybe even fight together even without wanting the same thing, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I've had some experiences where I've been on barricades with folk I absolutely despise, but it's not like I'm just going to let the cops arrest us all. Like, I'm still going to, you know, hold on to them when the stuff's happening. There's limits to that. There's folk who I'd gladly watch a fascist beat up because lol, fash on fash violence.
Right. Well, you're also pointing out that like fascism works in ways beyond like self-identified fascists, through transmisogyny, through the silencing of, you know, assault victims and stuff.
Yeah, like there's definitely folk like we had this situation. It was similar with the council, and I take this with individuals as well. If there's like an individual who's like really hurt me or been shit to me, I'm not gonna like go help them when they're like getting threatened. And it's the same with like the council. Like we couldn't keep going defending the council when fascists were protesting outside. It's like they'll fucking grass on us and nick us. We'll be stuck between the cops and the fash to protect fash inside the building. And it's just, I'd rather not spend my time doing that. You know, I can play role-playing games and like board games and live more meaningfully than, or with the moments I've got, than sort of defending those fuckers. And it's the same with like lefties who are like rapists or rape apologists. It's like, yeah, I hope they suffer. Like, and yeah, I've definitely fallen too much into like taking absolute glee in my enemies like suffering. It's become bad.
Well, yeah, that's something I kind of want to talk about, because I think like a lot of people might react to this, right, as the kind of glorifying of violence. You know, I mean, I've had lots of conversations with people, like the kind of kill your rapist mentality they find to be very problematic, because they do think that people can change, and that there's something worth investing in that. And there are people who are willing to do that work, which, you know, isn't for everyone, obviously.
Yeah, like if a victim wants that, that's cool. It's up to victims, isn't it? Like,
okay, so the thing that I have been recently trying to think through is how legacies of violence can like just continue to beget more violence, right? Like I see this again in Israel. Israel formed as a state, as in part in reaction to a history of violence and genocide, turning around and like ruling through violence and genocide, right? And then the reaction to Israel and the United States and other European countries like perpetuating this colonial violence is a violent reaction, right? With more violence. And that, how do we get outside of this kind of cycle of violence?
I think it's not on the folk who are like being oppressed. I think violence from oppressors is expected. It's normalized. It's like it's something that we're supposed to just sort of take passively. Violence from oppressed folk, it's not supposed to happen. It really does balance the logic of like, power and inequality. Like I might run into glorifying violence here. I don't know. I'm not an angel, but I think it is beautiful when oppressed folk use like, when kids throw rocks at tanks, like I really hope that they break a soldier's skull. Like, I think it's really a beautiful thing when folk rebel from a position of being like stood on.
Well, it's also, that's like totally different too. Like, I mean, this is why some people will like rename liberatory violence as self-defense, because if the situation of violence is created by the regime of whatever it is, like, the state and capitalism or colonialism or whatever, the people who are targeted by that violence fighting back isn't the same.
Yeah.
It's not the same violence, right? Although I don't know, yeah, throwing stones at a tank is clearly asymmetrical, right? where where it might be different is like, if it was like two fucking armies meeting, like, I don't know, the Ukraine and Russia is another place where I think a lot of anarchists are getting stuck talking about, because we can see that like Russia invading Ukraine is bad and harmful to the people trying to live their lives in Ukraine, but then supporting a state in response to another state seems to me to be a troubling anarchist response,
I think it's complicated, but like I support Ukraine against Russia. I am against Ukraine on behalf of trannies in Ukraine. I think like, I'd hate any state, I'd hate any cops. I don't really support the Ukrainian state, but like, I support Ukrainians against the genocide. Like they're also trying to be like wiped out, but by Russia. It's something to be like something my partner once said to me is the reason that our enemies use violence against us all the time is it's not because it's ineffective. Like I felt it. Like I'm scared to walk outside the front door sometimes, and I have been since I was a child, like so long, so many years of my life, because of street violence, because of the fact that I get just attacked in the street. That's something that like impacts how I'm like what the actions I'm able to do and like the ways I'm able to relate to the world. The sexual violence by the leftist movement, it's made it so I can't go to a lot of spaces and to a lot of things because the trauma of being around those kinds of apologists, like it stopped me from being able to live my life. So I understand. I have a very like personal relationship to how like when you put this violence back on the folk who do harm, like, and it's not the same because like their capacity to violence is like so subtle, whereas all I've ever felt like I had is my hands, and that's very easy to monsterize in the eyes of a lot of folk. Like we've made a lot of them squirm and like constantly like they're posting pro-trans stuff. They've talked about having to go to self-defense classes to hide from us, the anarchist scene in Liverpool. And it really is wonderful to like have these folk who've gotten away with their transphobia for so fucking long. And I know that they've harmed other trans folk before me, and I know that they will continue to harm other trans folk. I'm gone. It's just good to know that they're not gonna completely get away with it. They will be harmed. They will be targeted, and hopefully other abusers and other transphobes see that. And it's the same with other types of repression. I think it's the same with like Israel, Russia. Hopefully Israel and Russia see that their folk are dying and get scared off because they think they might fucking die.
Right. I mean,
like,
that's the sort of logic underneath this, is that like these people are not going to respond to anything except some kind of dire consequence, which in your argument is only dealt through violence, right? Like
I mean, it's the only tool I have that's really worth a damn. I think other folk have access to different tools, and obviously contexts vary. Like, it's just in my current position in life where I am who I am. That's what I've got. I don't like it when folk demonize that, but like I feel like there's a diversity of tactics, and I don't want to be like I have the right way of things. I know exactly how we should do things.
No, that's important. I think that's super important, because like this is also a place where like groups crumble, is like the inability to imagine different ways of doing things and thinking that your way is the right way and everyone has to fall in line with that is such a problem, right? Like, and even when I sit and critique the ways that people do things, I don't necessarily mean that to say they shouldn't do them, because I think that you learn through the experience. We don't know what's going to work you know, because if we did, we would have done the things already, you know? Yeah, I think that's often it's a kind of ideal that's touted, but I don't necessarily think is always really embraced in reality for people. So yeah, I don't want to like also like, you know, erase this experience that you've had that's very real of fear of actual harm and violence, and this like repeated experience that you have been talking about in within the leftist and anarchist spaces of being silenced or being forced, or you know, attempted to be forced into engaging with the people who've harmed you in a way that you don't want, you know, and that you would then develop a lack of trust for any of these things working.
And it's not just me, like I'm talking from my own experience, but I think a lot of the folk in FAF, we've had experiences with like the problem with like sexual abuse and transphobia on the left and in the movement. And like a lot of us would have different experiences, different stories to tell that sound very similar. It's really shocking. There's basically every city in this country, there's a problem with it. And not to let the fash off the hook. I mean, our enemies have fucking like their own little like grooming situations going on. Won't talk about it too long, but I like laughing at James Harvey, Students Against Tyranny, a real good source of entertainment for us. Just a fascist group in the country that have been sort of dying off. Their activity, it's just getting a lot less and a lot more desperate. They're trying to do like keep women's spaces, women's protests, but like, you know, Posey's not even really pulling numbers here anymore. It's kind of beautiful. There's a lot of the transphobia, it's like it's from folk who claim not to be transphobes. They're the folk who kill us, you know, landlords, bosses, the folk who they do like subtle things to like make our lives harder. They don't think of themselves as like trying to kill us. Like I feel like a lot of the Nazis are out in the rural areas and they don't have much power.
No, I mean this is, I think like this is something that we keep coming to in the kind of trans analysis or whatever, is that like the liberals maybe are the most harmful because of the insidious way that they work, but the liberals and the fascists end up siding together on this issue. And so there's like this kind of diversionary way of being like, we're not anti-trans, we just don't want there to be more trans people, right? And then the literal brute violence of the fascists, because there's like a kind of a spectrum from one side to the other, like it sweeps it in with it. And I also think that's why, personally, I think that's why meeting that stuff head on is kind of, it's like a losing game, because the force of anti-transness is a force of governance that either works or doesn't work. And right now it's working, and so they're going to use it, right? I don't know. I don't think we can just like convince people to like trans people and then it'll stop, you know?
Yeah, I think things are probably only going to get worse, but like it's that nihilist thing of like, you know, I'm not fighting to win or lose. I'm fighting to like still have a fire in my eyes whilst I'm here on this earth. Like I'm fighting to still be doing what I believe in and existing how I want. I'm not fighting for some like someday all the cis people are going to be nice to us. I think we'll never be equal to them, and that's fine. We're better. Yeah.
Wait, I mean, that's the other thing, is like not everyone is for everyone. We don't have to be friends with everyone. We don't have to like have relationships with everyone. And I think this is another thing that gets like,
and we don't have to win.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's another thing. I was actually thinking about this as you were talking, right? There's a lot of this kind of Christian ideology here. Like one is this kind of messianic idea that like all of the shit that we're doing now is worth it because it'll be redeemed in like heaven, you know? And this is like a way that like the revolution is kind of thought by a lot of leftists.
Yeah.
But the other thing that you're talking about is also this like Christian idea of forgiveness, right? That like this demand put on trans people to forgive the people who harm them in order to end up making common cause, right? It's like, and this is so often put on oppressed people, that like you have to act in a way that won't turn people away from your cause. And so therefore you can't be angry and violent because, and rather you have to like forgive the people who've harmed you, or like turn the other cheek.
I just want to expand on that and say it's this like, yeah, it's like the left has this fetishism with like mass organizing and convincing the people to do stuff, but like maybe the people that I want to convince are not folk who might or who are like still deciding whether or not to be transphobes. Maybe it's the actual transphobes in the street who want to harm me. Maybe I want to convince them that, you know, they can't just get away with hurting us, that we're not going to just leave it to the transphobic rapist cops to like supposedly keep us safe. Like, we'll actually keep ourselves safe. And like, I'm not trying to communicate with folk to make them not transphobic. I'm trying to communicate with folk to like make them stop hurting us and to like scare them out of stuff. Like, and I don't have to save the world. Other folk are there's so many other folk who are so much more like keen on that. Like, I'm not interested in like, you know, like trying to convince folk to like bring us along with them to assimilate into their world. I just want a certain level of autonomy and like independence. I don't want doctors to manage our bodies. I don't want, you know, teachers to exist. But let alone like, you know, like misgender trans kids is another thing that they do. Oh God, I do want to bring up, sorry, it's a bit out of thing, adult supremacy. Big problem on the left. Yeah, youth can make their own decisions. I feel like adult supremacy and like not like listening to youth, it's plays a similar role too in the Christian church, where it's, you know, like when folk are like sexually harassed or assaulted, it's not counted as valid. I also don't like activists who aren't willing to like do like illegal shit with youth on the basis of them being youth. I mean, you know, I wouldn't do that on the basis of someone being trans or whatever. I would happily stand at a direct action or do any of the things I talk about doing or I'm proud of doing with someone of any age if they were keen on it. And also, part of my perception of youth liberation is we're not there to save them. I mean, there's a problem with like animal lib fuckers have this as well, where it's like, oh, we have like so much more access to like privilege and power. It's like, no, if a kid is like a transphobe or a racist, I'm going to treat them like a transphobe or a racist. I'm not going to like be extra nice to them because they're young and they're also oppressed. You know, for me, that's treating folk as equals and like active solidarity. It's just, yeah, I've seen a lot of adult supremacy in leftist spaces.
I agree. Adult supremacy is one of the most unquestioned and naturalized hierarchies that adults have power over kids, and even anarchists will do this in so many ways. Like, just like by the very fact that there's like almost never young people in any anarchist space, right?
Yeah.
There's no voice of youth there. And it's particularly, I don't know, I think it's probably true over there, but here the kind of anti-trans intersection with adult supremacy is it's one of the major tools the state is using right now, and the fascists to.
I mean, yeah, we don't live as long. We don't live as long as cis people, you know, like I don't expect to see 60. It'd be a beautiful thing if I did, but like our life, you know, we're so oppressed that like when I was like, I don't think folks should have less rights for a fucking third or most of their lives. Because in a lot of trans folk, we die very young. I don't think folks should have less rights than folk who get older, just because those folk were able to get older because they weren't oppressed. I think trans liberation is youth liberation, is trans liberation is youth liberation. They're so connected, and so many trans folk want to like separate out the two and be like, oh, you can't give DIY stuff to kids, and it's like, well, fucking puberty blockers are a compromise with cis people that still don't give us like a decent enough quality of life. You know, if I could have started growing tits the same age as everyone else, I would have not looked back. And that's on me. You know, that's my decision.
Yeah, I mean, I do see this even with trans people. I think like a fear of the youth, which comes from, sometimes it's a kind of gatekeeping based on your own difficult experience of getting to where you were, and like kind of even maybe sometimes unconsciously thinking other people have to go through the same, you know, trials and tribulations or whatever. But I also think it comes from this idea that like the young trans people are doing it differently, and that's threatening. Not simply because they might have more access to things that, you know, we didn't have access to when we were young, but also because they're like also changing what transness even means in the process of that. And I think there is a kind of reactionary and conservative strand of, you know, trans people who are threatened by that, and threatened by not understanding, like wanting to understand and not being able to. And this is something for me that I feel like I feel very strongly about, is that like trans youth are doing stuff that we don't know. We don't know where that's going. We don't know what that is. And I don't want to know. Like, I don't want to know in advance, because that feels to me like it would be taking their power away.
Yeah, I mean, there's that great quote, and I don't know who it's by, and that's probably for the best, but like, my dream is to someday get shot for being a reactionary. Like, yeah, it's really beautiful, and I'm hardly like the end of like what liberation looks like. We're not the end of what liberation looks like. Like someday folk are gonna, hopefully there will be folk who come about who are even more based and even more cool. Yeah.
This is like a common thread through all of the stuff that we've been talking, is like this desire to know and to be right that often happens in the left and among anarchists, that it just ignores the way that we're still totally kind of stuck within these systems. That do you want to go back to Faf and talk a little bit more about the kind of ending of it?
If I could just say a few things about it, I think it was a really beautiful thing that I'm glad I've done with my life, that I'm glad I can move on from. It's not an org that's going to haunt me like a lot of the other ones I've joined or been a part of. We did cool shit, we did fun shit, we did silly shit, we put up silly graffiti, but that was also had better fucking politics than half the stuff that takes itself so seriously. We targeted fascists, we've targeted the police, we've evened out some of the inequalities in our own lives, we've been there for each other and we've backed each other up, and I've really fallen in love with a lot of the folk I've done stuff with. So I think that's why I'm glad that we're ending it, is because like I can have that and move on and do something else and like try and continue living my life. I'm not just going to keep trying to keep this group going forever and keep my place within it as like, oh, someone who was involved earlier. Like, no, like fuck it. Like, let something else happen. Let someone else do shit, and like I'll see if I can help other folk out with their passions and their plans. I'm really proud of it.
I also like, I mean, I think the humor aspect of it is like important. Like, you know, even the name Femboys Against Fascism, and the kind of actions and things that you've said and done. Like, I think that's important. I don't think that's just like incidental. That like the approach of humor and kind of absurdity in some ways, like it's another kind of counter to this kind of leftist piety and moralism that gets us stuck so often.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a shame we didn't manage to sell many newspapers, you know. No, I was just taking the piss out of the social.
Right. Yeah. You know, you set up your table at the protest and sell your newspapers. Before we stop, there are people, you know, I get into conversations with people a lot, and there's going to be people who, you know, don't like the way that you're like framing things, or don't support the things that you're saying, specifically because you know, they think what's important is like moving away from violence, because one of the problems of the world is how dominated it is by violence, or because they feel like, you know, that one of the most important things we can do to sort of get outside of this carceral colonial system is to, you know, not punish people, to imagine the possibility of transformation. So, I mean, what do you think about that kind of critique?
I mean, it depends from the individual. You know me quite well, so like, I think I've explained before that like in different conversations that like violence is something that's come for me quite a lot, and it's something that I used to very much like. I'm still terrified every time I get into a fight. I don't want to like act like I'm some hard bitch, but
yeah,
like it's also like it's not the violence that I enact as a trans person who's beat up a lot of cis men. That's like really beautiful and liberatory, and like it's not really anyone else's business to tell me that I'm like doing bad for the movement or whatever, because I don't care about the movement. I care about me and like my partner and like my friends. I care about, you know, just living my life, and I'm not really interested in like this like project to sort of create like some sort of perfect world. A lot of folk like to moralize around violence, and I don't judge anyone who doesn't take that approach. I think that's valid, and folk can live the way they want to live. It's just I would take offense at anyone equivocating like the kind of shit I do with the kind of shit that like Fash do, because the shit I do is fun and cool. Yeah.
I mean, I think like the problem here of like people imagining that whatever tactic or action you take has to be like you're making this a rule, you know, like and I don't like, like you, first of all, you defending yourself isn't like that's then the description of the world you want, or like the rule of how everyone has to behave in every moment. I'm sure also there's fights that you decide not to engage in because they're not, that either you feel like you're outnumbered or out, you know, armed, or you're not.
I mean, yeah, I'm trans. Like every time I walk down the street, someone's offering me a fight. Like, you know, you've got to pass up so you can go get your groceries. But like that bashing back it's exhilarating and it's wonderful, and I don't want to take away from it. For me, it's become some great therapy, and it makes me feel like I have like autonomy that they've took from me, that like oppressors and bigots took from me. It makes me feel like I'm taking it back. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think maybe that's a good place to kind of end our conversation, because I want to like end with your feeling there and that experience. And
thanks. I love you with all my heart.
I love you too.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, it's lovely talking to you.
You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. To support us, go to patreon.com/thebreakuptheory or rate and follow us on any place that you get your podcasts. If you want to share a story with us to talk about in a future episode, you can write us at forum.jotforum.com/thebreakuptheory/stories or call at 917-426-6548. Now stay tuned for 2 songs by Femboys Against Fascism.
Those motherfuckers want to keep us in a cage. Their personalities I hate, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I want to destroy the prisons that they call families. The father keeps the others in slavery, but the kids do what the mother says, and the mother threatens with the fathers. First kill the father, destroy all of them. How many are suffering every day inside themselves, but they won't know, they might never know what they regret, who they could have been if they didn't just be who they were told to be. I want to destroy the prisons they call marriages. The husband beats his wife cause he thinks she's his wife. Watches the years go by and every day waits for him to die. If only she'd try, that husband would die. Love regulated by social expectations removes the chance for any connection other than that which is built on shit. Those personalities that are regulated. So if you are cis straight and you're fucking listening, then stay the fuck away from me. Change your own fucking people, fight their bigotry, and stay away from mine. We've got something better and we're gonna keep it, and it's not for your kind. Well, hello anarchists in your communities. I've got some things to share about rapists and apologia. They're in those communities and they're in your homes. Nobody talks about it, so you never really know. And if anyone's been in these spaces for long enough, they've seen it before and not left. So I will expect them to protect their privilege themselves, their friends, but they can't defend against ultra-violence. And when I felt my fist on his face, their misogyny and attempt to control me faded away while he had his community. And I got my trans body and I won't let any community fuck with my autonomy. Yeah, I'll attack every rapist that I see with my fist in the back of their head, saying stay the fuck away from trannies. With my fist in the back of their head, saying stay the fuck away from trannies. With my fist in the back of their head, saying stay the fuck away from me. I never agreed to transformative means to hide all of this away. The process exists to obscure complicity and ensure everyone gets to say that the process has been followed or that it was successful when it works to hide the problem away. Anarcho-lawyers don't expect us to attack them. That's where the mistaken KYL are old every day. And when I felt my fist on his face, that misogyny and attempt to control me, it faded away while he had his community. And I got my trans body and I won't let any community fuck with my autonomy. Yeah, I'll attack every rapist that I see with my fist in the back of their head, saying stay the fuck away from trannies. With my fist in the back of their head, saying stay the fuck away from trannies. With my fist in the back of their head, saying stay the fuck away from me. And the same goes out to journalists and communists, rape apologists, and anyone who believes in justice and the things they do to enforce misogyny. You're misogynist, so get the fuck away from me. And when I get the chance, I'm going to bash the block my chance.